Good morning. Welcome to Reynolda Church. If I haven't met you before, my name is Chris. I serve as our executive pastor. Our lead pastor, Alan Wright, is out of the pulpit this weekend. He'll be back with us next weekend. Special word of welcome to all those who are joining us online today, people who are worshiping with us at the Clemens campus, the Union Cross campus, those who are gathering at the Ascent at the Village campus, and maybe those who are joining us even today down at the Beginning Work in Lake Norman. One of my favorite stories to tell at a wedding goes something like this. This couple sits down at the table to celebrate the morning of their 60th wedding anniversary. They were both nearing 80 and had gotten married in their late teenage years, and they had spent 60 years married together. And her husband leaned across the table to his wife and said, "After 60 years of marriage, I find you to be tried and true." The problem was that almost 80, she'd lost a lot of her hearing, so she said, "What?" He leaned in a little bit and said, "I find after 60 years of marriage that you are tried and true." She looked at him with confusion and said, "What?" So a little louder this time he said, "After 60 years of marriage, I find you to be tried and true." She slammed her glass down and said, "After 60 years of marriage, I'm tired of you too." 60 years. Are you ready for some good news? The word commitment is the new profanity of a coming generation. Don't commit. You might miss out on something better. Why would I commit when I can have all the benefits of commitment without being tied down? Yet the gospel is all about commitment, but not how you might think. Only when you begin to understand the commitment that the Father has made to you do you begin to see how free your commitment to the Father becomes. Turn with me today to Matthew chapter 16. Matthew chapter 16. The headline read, "The Commitment Phobia Generation." In 1970, it said 21% of Americans had reached the age of 25 without getting married. But William Galston, the senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, went on to say, by 2005, that figure had grown to 60%, and by 2018, 72%. The number of adults in the population that live at home has increased by 50% since the 1970s. Galston says this of today's young adults: they are much less likely to have committed themselves to a mate or to a career. And many go back and forth between episodic education and temporary jobs, between living independently and in their parents' home. And although millennials sometimes get a bad rap for their fear of commitment, it really is true of all people. Pay-as-you-go gym membership and cell phone membership that's by the month or a la carte are on the rise. And the average church attender worships approximately 1.4 times per month, or once every 3 weeks. On Facebook, we all have hundreds of friends without any commitment to actually be their friend, as in being there to console them at 2 a.m. We can like someone's post without saying what we like about it, or accept someone's friend request without ever meeting them. Even a cell phone contract or a Facebook friendship can feel like a commitment that is so restricting. See, in the end, there's a part of us that believe commitment restricts all of our freedom. There's even language for the ways in which we talk about this. It's called FOMO, fear of missing out. It's the idea that if we make a commitment, we may miss out on something that's better to come. My 4-year-old has FOMO. Several weeks ago, I was in charge of him for a few hours by myself, so I did what every father does, which is I took him to Walmart and said, "Get whatever you want." So I let him run around the aisles of the Walmart toy department for about 10 minutes. And he just couldn't decide what he wanted. At first he thought he'd pick something, and then he decided, no, I don't want this on this aisle. I'll go back to this aisle. Finally, I just pulled up a chair and watched him run back and forth between the 4 aisles. Finally, I said, Zachary, it's probably time for us to go. And he said, just one more minute. And then I noticed that he was lining up a whole series of toys. And I said, what are you doing? He said, I'm trying to make my choice. And I said, well, any of those will be good enough. And he looked at me and said, but I want what's best. See, he was afraid that if he made a decision that he would miss out on some other toy that was better or more enticing. I think we are all afraid of commitment because it restricts our freedom. It restricts our freedom to be responsive, spontaneous. In lack of commitment, and our heart assures us we think that we won't miss out on something better. Today, as we continue our series called Unleashed, the title of this message is Freedom Through Commitment. See, what if commitment isn't restricting at all? What if you have been lied to about the true nature of commitment? What if commitment isn't actually bondage, but instead is a really beautiful kind of freedom? Today's text is Matthew 16, verses 24 through 26. I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version. Then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? We live in a culture that is consumed by winning, by getting, by advancement, by taking the shortcut. But the story of Jesus marks something of a paradox to our cultural assumptions. This text here in Matthew 16 is not uncommon in Scripture. As a matter of fact, it's not even uncommon in Matthew. Matthew, writing to a Jewish audience, revealing to them Jesus as King of the Jews, back in chapter 10, says something of the same lesson when he says, whoever loves the father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves the son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. The same thing shows up in Mark chapter 10. Truly I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or lands for my sake and for the gospel who will not receive 100-fold now in this time. Houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands with persecutions, and in the age to come eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and last first. Luke's gospel in chapter 14 says it this way, whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. John 12 says, truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. This reflects something of what we learn in the Old Testament. Psalm 49, 7-9. Truly, no man can ransom another or give to God the price of his life. For the ransom of their life is costly and can never suffice. That he would live on forever and never see the pit. All four Gospels, and one of them twice, has some of the reflection of this paradox that lives in contrast to what our culture tells us. Our culture says, get, take, advance, look out for yourself. Don't make a commitment, because if you do, you might miss out on something better. And Jesus says, commitment in my kingdom looks like something really dramatic. It looks like taking up your cross daily and following me. So that by the time we get to Matthew's Gospel, the 16th chapter, verse 24, we're beginning to see something of this reflection of how freedom comes through commitment. And Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up my cross. What does Jesus mean? I think very simply, he means if you are a believer, this is what believing in me looks like. I think quite literally he was saying to those who follow him, have you disowned yourself so that you can own freedom? This is why last week we began this series together by talking about Adam and Eve's misconception of submission. Remember, one of the great lies of our enemy is this: freedom comes outside of authority. So the serpent comes to Adam and Eve in the garden and he says, if you really want to have freedom, you have to eat of that tree. Because if you eat of that tree, you will see as God sees. And if you see as God sees, you'll no longer need him. And once his authority, once his oppression is off of you, then you will find true freedom. In fact, the rejection of God's authority was so dramatic that God had to intervene cosmically with his son to undo their rejection of authority. Because when they rejected it, they found bondage. And God, through Jesus, had to reestablish their freedom. Today, as we look at what it means to find freedom through commitment, to be unleashed into our true identity, we are reminded that on one hand, we don't want to be people who seek out suffering. Like if you have a friend who thinks that they can come into closer union with Jesus by seeking out suffering, find different friends. Their life is going to be disproportionately hard. But at the same time, if we're being honest, we admit that life is full of seasons of challenge and suffering. And the good news about it is that we never have to feel alone. So that when we come to seasons where we feel like we've been betrayed, we can reflect on the fact that Jesus himself was betrayed. And so we come into unity with Christ. When we ourselves find ourselves to be abandoned, we can find comfort in knowing that Jesus himself was abandoned. I am a child of divorce. My parents, by the time I was in kindergarten, had decided that their marriage would not work. And in some ways, I've found God's redemption throughout that story my whole life. But when brokenness happens in our story, it has implications for our entire life. And so as I look back at my life, some of the places that I have found myself to be the most insecure have been in places where I fear being abandoned. Because there's something about not growing up in a two-parent household that suggests there's always a risk of someone who you love and someone who loves you will leave. And so whether that was in my dating relationships or even in my marriage or even in my friendships, there's always this deep fear that I'm going to be abandoned, that someone's not going to find me lovable enough, smart enough, funny enough, whatever it might be, always not enough. And in that, they're going to reject me and I'm going to feel abandoned. Now, the good news about that is that one of the ways that God has brought deep gospel healing to my life is by reminding me that when I feel abandoned, I have a Father in heaven who sent his only begotten Son, who is now my brother, and he felt it too. And because he got victory over his abandonment, I can as well. See, taking up your cross daily is not just about being saved, but it's about knowing that when betrayal or abandonment or when opportunities to use your power and authority in ways that are not God-honoring and you allow those things to be suppressed for the benefit of others, or when you're being misunderstood or maligned, when all of those things happen in your life, when you're taking up those crosses like Jesus did, you know you're not alone. So you die to self. Take up your cross. Disown yourself. Take up his story. It is the acknowledgement for all of us that we were due death, not life. Persecution, not exaltation. Rejection and shame, not acceptance and freedom. And when we find that out and take up our cross, we then know that Jesus meets us in those places. And so Jesus says, if you take up your cross and follow me. But in verse 25, he continues, for whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. What Jesus is talking about here is, what does it mean to lose your life so that you can find it? This is the very picture of redemption. It's the very story of what it means to be saved. The very story of being saved is to acknowledge that we were yet sinners. We use vernacular in the church, language in the church that to outsiders sounds like voodoo. Like, what does it mean when you say to be saved? I didn't know I needed to be rescued. Here, simply put, is what it means to be saved for the Christian. God is holy, we rejected him. Because God is holy, and we are no longer holy because of our rejection, we cannot be in the presence of a holy God. It would violate his holiness. So God made a way for us to be made holy again. He sent his only begotten Son, who died in our place for our sins, lived the life we could never live, so he was raised from the dead. And because we believe he was raised from the dead, he got victory over sin. He got victory over death. And now, when we believe in him, it's really that simple. Do you believe that Jesus was raised from the dead? If you say yes, then Jesus says, all who call upon my name shall be saved. And here's the great news. Something miraculous happens. See, we would say sometimes, well, we're a church that believes in the supernatural, and we are. We believe that people are healed and restored in miraculous ways, but every church should be a supernatural church, because what happens in the redemption of sinners is supernatural. We place our faith in God because of what he has done in Jesus. And the Bible says in 2 Corinthians 5 that the old us is gone and the new us has come, because the same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead, when we believe in Jesus, Jesus shares that Spirit with us. And everything about us begins to renew. Our mind, our heart, our body. But the promise is not just for today, where God does a miraculous thing in us. The promise is that one day, God's going to restore us completely. And we're going to spend eternity with him in heaven. You lose your life by saying, I'm dead, so that you can find it in Jesus. And in verse 26, he continues, for what will it profit a man if he gains the world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? Now this brings us to the paradox that I alluded to earlier. In other words, Jesus says you have a choice. You can go for it now and lose it forever, or you can know that in the end, God makes all things right. See, life is often defined, like this text says, by what you place value on. Do you place value on now or eternity? And there are miraculous ways in which God works through us today. And there are miraculous ways in which God restores us and heals us and transforms us. But all of us who believe in Jesus know that that's just a foretaste of a coming fulfillment of that promise. We're just getting a taste of what eternity with God's going to look like. And so here Jesus is saying, you know, on one hand, take up your cross daily, and here's what taking up your cross daily looks like. And taking up your cross daily is realizing to die is gain, to give up your identity and to be absorbed by Jesus' identity is gain. And then he continues on and says, what would it profit you to benefit now but lose your soul? Live your life with the end in mind. Live your life knowing that God has created you for a great destiny that you get a foretaste of now and a fulfillment of later. So much of this feels countercultural. Or even not even countercultural, counter to our very nature and our own wisdom. If we don't advocate for ourselves, who will? If we don't look out for our own best interest, if we don't reserve the idea of being committed to things in ways in which we are always waiting for what, maybe you even say God's best. So we never commit. We never say yes. Here's the problem with commitment. I think in all of our hearts, we have a desire to do the right thing, to make commitments that we keep. Some of that is the simple day-to-day things, like just letting your yeses be yes and your nos be no. And then some of those are like enormous covenantal commitments, like marriage. But we have found in our own lives that even when we try, we can't keep the commitment. This is reflective of something of what we learned together this summer in the Proverbs, where like even when we know what wisdom looks like, we're unable to do it. Two paths diverge in the wood. One's wise, one's foolish. We know which one's wise. We try to walk to it. We just end up finding ourselves so often pulled over towards foolishness. But then at the same time, we see these ideas in Scripture about God calling us towards commitment. Commitment to our family and our job. Commitment to the things that God has created us uniquely for. But even when given the opportunity, how is it that we so frequently fail to live up to our commitments? How is it that we are so frequently finding that our yeses mean no and our nos mean yes? Well, on one level, being committed to something feels too restricting to our freedom. And on another level, we so often just give up. I mean, all of us this week committed that this week we're going to eat healthy. And we got like 2 days into it, like, I want pizza. And that seems trivial, but I mean, for many of us, it's frustrating. And it kind of has implications through our entire story. That on one hand, being committed to things feels restricted. I want to keep my options open. On the other hand, being committed is just something that we never even find ourselves to be able to do. And so if we can't do it and we don't want to do it, we just never do it. We just never make those commitments. And so if we find it so difficult to make those kinds of commitments and keep them, if we find it so difficult to keep commitments that seem on the surface trivial, like diet and workout and Bible reading, then it goes much further to explain why it is we feel the difficulty to feel that our faith is flourishing, that our relationship with our Father in heaven is thriving. I mean, I can't get to Tuesday without eating a piece of pizza. No wonder I can't find myself with the kind of depth and wisdom and passion for my faith that I would like to have. And it might be that you would expect at this point that I would give you like 4 ways to keep commitments. But the truth is if there's anything true about the Christian faith, it's this. Our efforts to do anything come up short. So there must be some secret to commitment that the gospel reveals. And in the end, it's not our commitment to be better, do better, say the right thing. It's not our commitment to be a better husband, be a better parent, be a better colleague or friend. Because in the end, as honest as we are, and as deeply held that commitment might be initially, There's something about our very nature that causes us to come up short when we make a commitment. And so in the end, freedom through commitment doesn't come because we ratchet up our promises to ourselves. It comes when we understand more deeply every day who first committed to us. Let me use this illustration to conclude our day. My wife and I are very protective parents. We're protective about who watches them, what they watch, and we're not perfect parents, but we are trying hard every day to give them an environment where they will flourish. And I was thinking today about what it would mean if someone came to me and said, hey, Chris, we're friends. You've known me your whole life, and I would like to take your child, your oldest son, out to ice cream. Well, in that case, I would probably say yes. Someone I knew and I trusted. What if someone came to me and said, hey, Chris, I'd like to take your kid out to ice cream, but you know me, but you don't know me that well, but you can trust me because these other people say you can trust me. Can I take them? I would probably go with them, or I might hesitantly say, yes, you can have access to my son. What if someone came up to me who they were a stranger? Someone I never met, and they said, listen, I know you don't know me, but you can trust me. Can I take your son out to ice cream? I said, no way. If you feel like that you should be able to go to ice cream with us, I'll go with you. You will get to know each other. We'll have a 10-year relationship, maybe then. But what if, on the other hand, if you see how quickly we would get to a place in our relationship with our own children where we would say, no, that's too far. I'm going to step in and protect them from that. Imagine what it's felt like for the Father in heaven, who, because of our rejection of His goodness, He had to solve the problem. And so He allowed His only Son, have 2 sons and 1 daughter. And as much as I like you, I'm sure you're a delightful person. I'm sure God's doing a lot of good things for you. I wouldn't let my child suffer a paper cut so that you could benefit from it. Imagine God the Father, who's in perfect relationship throughout all eternity with His Son, allowing His Son to come to earth and live the life that we could never live, in perfect obedience to Him. Jonathan Edwards used to joke that everybody sins the moment they wake up. And then if they don't think they've sinned, when they just did because of their arrogance. In every way, I'm missing the mark of what God's trying to do in my life. But His Son comes in perfect obedience to Him, lives the life that I could never live. But because I had rejected God, the only way for me to be in relationship with my Father is for something about that relationship to change. And my commitment to Him come up empty every time. The whole Old Testament is about one story, Israel's commitment to God that came up short. Over and over and over again. So if it's impossible for my commitments to the Father to ever fix that relationship, the only thing that will ever fix it is the Father's commitment to me. And by allowing His Son to die in my place for my sins, the Father made a cosmic commitment in me that is an assurance that my story isn't over. Because when I begin to understand the depth and beauty of the Father's commitment to me, only then do I begin to understand I can't do it. Then by what power can I? Resurrection power. The Father's commitment to His Son didn't end with allowing Him to die the death I should have died, but because Jesus never one time missed the mark, never one time violated the holiness of His Father, on Sunday morning, God the Father sent the Spirit to wake His Son up from the dead. And then for every person who ever places their faith in Jesus as King, Jesus shares that same Spirit with us. How is it possible that our yeses could be yes and our no's could be no? How is it possible that we could grow every day to be more like Jesus? How is it possible that we could be sent out into the world to ask the world one question, the same question that Jesus asked Peter, who do you say I am? That's the question we ask the world. Every tribe, every nation, every tongue, who do you say Jesus is? By what authority do we make the commitments to let our yeses be yes, our noes be noes, to ask the world this one simple question, who do you say I am? Or maybe more practically, how do we live our lives in commitment to our marriage and our kids and our jobs and our friendships? We don't do it out of some empty promise that we're going to be more committed, we're going to be better. Instead, we say, I can't do it. I'm going to take up my cross daily. And I'm going to know that the only way to keep my commitments and to find freedom in those commitments is to die to self. Paul says in Philippians 1:21, to live is Christ, to die is gain. How is that possible? Every time I die to self, Spirit of the living God comes into me, transforms me, sets me free, and I am able to do exactly the things that God created me to do, because God is far more committed to you than you could ever be to yourself. And if you have any question about that, look at Him allowing His Son to be crushed for you. God is so committed to you that He refused to allow you to stay where you were in eternal separation from Him. And because He, the creator of the universe, is so committed to me, it empowers my commitment to be more like His Son. And that's the gospel.